Peter Moore was a British serial killer who managed cinemas in Wales by day and became a terrifying monster by night. In today's episode, I'll be speaking to Peter Moore's defense solicitor, Rhys Jones, about what it's like representing a man accused of murdering 4 men and committing sex attacks on 39 other men over a 20-year period. Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 16 of the Student's Verdict podcast. Thank you so much for joining me on another true crime adventure. To all of you new listeners, hi, my name is Emily and I'm your host. If you haven't already, please go and listen to some of our earlier episodes, which include cases such as the disappearance of Kelly Berg-Dove, the story of Rob Knox, and the case of the Toolbox Killers. Please follow us on Instagram at the Student Verdict Pod and on Twitter at Student Verdict. If you like the show, please consider leaving us a review. If you don't like us, then please keep your comments to yourselves. Before we get into today's episode, I want to tell you about something super exciting, the launch of the Student's Verdict merchandise. In the first collection, you'll find t-shirts, hoodies, and sweatshirts in a variety of colours with our new logo, perfect for this winter season. I'll include a link in the show notes for you to check it out. If you buy anything, please tweet me a picture at Student Verdict, tag me on Instagram at the Student Verdict Pod, and on the Student's Verdict Facebook page. The final thing is to give a special shout out to my first patron, Rebecca Rosewood. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for supporting the show. If you'd like to support the show yourself, you can find us on Patreon. There are 4 tiers ranging from £3 up to £20 a month with a variety of benefits, including shout outs like the one you just heard, stickers, early access to ad-free episodes, and even merchandise. Now, with all of that said, let's jump into today's episode. I'd like to welcome to the show today's very special guest, Defence Solicitor Mr. Rhys Jones. Can you please introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about you?
Yes, well, thank you for your welcome. My name is Rhys Jones. I'm a former defence solicitor now. I don't work as a defence solicitor now. I've been involved in representing people for over 20 years or so. I've then worked in colleges and universities as well, teaching law and teaching criminology. And then recently I've turned my hand to writing as well. And I've written a book about the story of the time that when I was a relatively young lawyer, I represented Peter Moore, who, as we subsequently discovered, was a serial killer.
And how did you get into criminal law in the first place?
Well, believe it or not, initially, what I wanted to be was an actor. All through the time I was in school, that was my aim, to be an actor. And I take part in different productions in school and youth theatre and so on. And I did that for a number of years. But then I thought, as I got into to do A levels, and so thought maybe I should look for something that I had another interest in, just in case the acting didn't work. And I was interested in law. I was interested in sort of criminal law and so on, the things that people generally find interesting in the law. And that's what sort of drew me to the law initially, was sort of interest in sort of crime and representing people who'd been charged with horrible crimes and so on. And I thought maybe I'd be interested in doing that, and maybe at a sideline doing a little bit of acting as well. And as if any lawyers are listening will know, a lot of standing up in court is acting anyway. So I got to do both things at the same time.
That's really interesting that you say that. I suppose I've never really put the two together, but actually you're right. You are, when you are, for example, in a trial, you are presenting to an audience, so to speak, in the form of the jury. That's so interesting. I never thought about it like that.
I've always thought of myself as a performer, really, when I was in court. That's the aspect that I really enjoyed as a criminal lawyer, as a lawyer through the time I was dealing in the law, was really the opportunities I had to go to court and represent people and be involved in trials and so on. Those were for me, the exciting bits, and maybe it was that performing aspect of my character which was coming to the fore during those times, at least.
Well, one story, the one that we're going to be talking about today, the case of Peter Moore. Before we delve into it, can you tell us how that file came onto your desk, how it landed on your desk, how you came to be involved in it?
Yes. Well, my firm had been involved with Peter Moore for about 2 years, maybe 18 months before his arrest. He was a businessman, and he'd had some business problems, and one of my colleagues was helping him out with that. And then about 18 months before he was arrested, his mother passed away, and a colleague helped him with the probate of her estate, which was relatively small. There wasn't much to do, just a bit of form filling and bits and bobs. And that's about it. That's all we had by way of dealings with him until I received a phone call a few days before Christmas 1995. And as I was leaving the office to get some lunch, a phone call came through to the reception, and one of the receptionists there said, "Delaney, I think you better have a word with this man." And there was a man there who described himself as a friend of Peter Moore's, and he told me that Peter Moore had been arrested during that morning, and that he required my assistance because people sort of knew in the area that I lived and the area that I practiced that I was a criminal lawyer. My name was in the paper and bits and bobs. So I think it was one of the first names that came to mind was my name, and I was asked then to call the police station to find out what was going on. His friend didn't know anything. His friend didn't know what he'd been arrested for, what the circumstances were, nothing at all. All we knew after I received that phone call was that Peter Moore was in the police station and he needed some assistance.
So you effectively were sort of walking into it blind, in as far as
Yes.
you didn't have any facts at all. Now, that moment when you learn what it is that he is being arrested for, that must have come as a huge shock to your firm, who have obviously dealt with him previously in completely unrelated matters, quite sort of normal, quote unquote, normal matters, wills and etc. Yes. It must have come as a huge shock to all of you.
It was a shock. I had met Peter Moore on a couple of occasions when he'd come to the office, passed the time of day with him, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
He was, to all intents and purposes, a very well-spoken, polite, respectable individual. To my mind, he was a simple businessman who lived in the area, and there wasn't anything out of the ordinary in him at all. And therefore, you're quite right in saying, when I heard of his arrest, and when I was travelling to the police station, really, I wasn't aware of what he'd been arrested for. And, in the back of my mind was the thought that maybe it was something like sort of driving with excess alcohol, or, or some motoring matter, or even some matter with money or finances or something, it could have been something like that. But I certainly didn't think of what was actually going to face me when I arrived in the police station. It was one of the last things I considered.
Your first impression then is was that this man that you met and had spent time with, was that he was quite ordinary, quite
Yes,
normal.
nothing out of the ordinary at all. If you saw him walking past you on the street, you wouldn't think twice. He was quite a sort of relatively tall, about 6 footish, I think, sort of tall, lean, built person. He had a sort of thin, with a bit of a thin face, with a long, sort of bit of a long chin, but nothing that you would say, oh, there's a strange looking man there or something out of the ordinary at all. Certainly not. And that makes the whole thing, in a way, um, even more scary when you delve into the whole story. And it's also something that I've used subsequently when I've been teaching students about criminal law and criminology and so on, is that one thing you don't do when you are a criminal lawyer is judge a book by its cover. Um, it's impossible. You have no idea what a person's circumstances, background, story, history, what they're up to. It's impossible. And you certainly, if you're not aware of that when you become a criminal lawyer, you become aware of it very quickly after you do.
That's so true. And I know we've touched upon this a little bit because you said that Peter was a businessman, but is there anything that was sort of particularly interesting about Peter's background, or again, was it quite ordinary?
Quite ordinary. Well, there are questions when you delve into his background in hindsight, which may answer some of the questions to his subsequent behaviour, though not all. He was a single child. His family moved from St Helens to Kinmel Bay near Rhyl in North Wales when he was fairly young. I think he was about 4 or 5. Um, the impression I've got from speaking with people is that he was a bit of a loner. He he was quite effeminate in his ways, and during school he'd been bullied because of that. And I think the impression I've got both from him and from people who were teaching us at the school he was in during that time was that he certainly didn't have a happy time at school. It was very difficult and challenging for him. Um, and I think he was very much a mummy's boy as well. Certainly from what he told me afterwards when I talked with him, his mother meant a great deal to him, and his father was more of an authoritarian figure, maybe even a bit of a bully, and he viewed his father as the tough man of the family, which he didn't really get to know as well, I think. So there are aspects of his personality and character which raise questions, and certainly there were questions that were discussed and raised at the time of the case. Subsequently, he was a businessman insofar as that he had a small business in Kinmel Bay, which he'd inherited from his father, and he then, because of his interest in cinemas, had begun to buy and take over small cinemas across North Wales. These places which, to all intents and purposes, were coming to the end of their days. They looked a bit drab and down at heel, but he took them over and, on lots of occasions, gave them new life. They were children. I've heard many a person say to me, well, as a child, I used to go to one of his cinemas near Holywell for the Saturday morning film show. And he would give us all sweets, and we would sit in the cinema watching children's films all morning. And
Wow.
there was this thing that he was trying to sort of revive these small cinemas across North Wales. Of course, what he then that allowed him to do was travel across North Wales. And that was one of the reasons why his crimes, when they came, were spread across quite a wide area of North Wales.
Okay, so he seems like, we keep saying it, but he seems like an ordinary man. You know,
Yes.
he works, he seems good with children. So nothing stands out. He's not sinister. He's not
No,
sort of scary or anything like that. So
no.
you received this phone call that says you need to go to the police station because Peter Moore is down there. In your head, you're thinking, okay, driving offence maybe, or yeah, as you said, sort of drink driving, something like that. So let's talk about your time in the police station when you were representing Peter. As police have interrogated him, obviously you've learned that it's actually 4 murders that he is being
Yes.
investigated for. What what goes through your head?
Well, that was a process really for me, because initially when I arrived at the police station, I was told that he was being investigated for one murder that had happened near Abergele on the North Wales coast in a place called Pensarn. And a man had been found there on the early hours of the morning. He apparently had been stabbed on a number of occasions, left to die on the beach, and he was found by a dog walker on the beach the following day. And that's all they were investigating. For the first couple of days, the investigation, as far as Peter Moore was concerned, was being focused on this murder on the beach in Pensarn. I received a phone call 2 days into the investigation at about 1:30 in the morning. It was the day after we'd been at the magistrates' court fairly late the previous evening, because the Crown Prosecution Service needed to apply for consent to extend the time that Peter Moore was in custody, because the investigation continued and was to continue and so on. I'd got home, went to sleep, few hours of sleep, 2 hours of sleep, if that. Phone call, can you please get back to the police station as soon as possible? Peter Moore wants to speak to you. And he says he wants to confess. Now, obviously, I was thinking at that time, well, it must be a confession to the murder on Pensarn Beach. Got in my car, off I went to the police station. When I got there, I had a private consultation with Peter Moore. And there I was told that he wanted to confess to 4 murders and between 20 and 30 quite vicious assaults on men over a period of about 20 years. Now you can imagine this now was escalating to something unimaginable. Certainly in those first few days, it was something that I hadn't considered at all. And after speaking with Peter Moore for some time, he was quite adamant. He wanted to make the admissions. He'd even drawn a plan of where one of the bodies had been disposed of that he hadn't. The police weren't aware of one murder. They were aware of 2 others, but not of the 4th. And we went into the interview, and we had what I would only describe as the most surreal, unbelievable interview that I'd ever experienced. And certainly in the conversation I had with the 2 detectives who were involved in the interview as well afterwards, that they had ever experienced. Sitting there listening to a man confess in detail to 4 murders, and as far as he could, then relatively briefly sketching out his activities over 20 years, assaulting men in the North Wales area, some of them in very brutal ways. So it was an absolutely shocking 45 minutes of an interview. that I was certain that I wouldn't experience again. And I think the three of us, the two detectives and myself, felt the same. It was just unbelievable.
What did you think then? So he said to you, I want to confess, and you've had this interview with police. He's told you in detail, and the officers in detail, this is what happened to this man and blah, blah, blah. So when he says he's going to plead not guilty, what went through your head?
Lots of questions and complete confusion, I think. What happened was that obviously I left the police station the early hours of that morning. I think the interview was about 2:30 in the morning. By about 4 o'clock, I was leaving the police station, and I'd made arrangements to go back to see him at about 9 o'clock in the morning that morning. So later on, 4 or 5 hours later, and so I left. It was, an experience I'd never had before. I'd never represented anybody who had admitted to killing four people, and certainly in such a brutal way, and be willing to volunteer so much information and so much detail about the way he'd committed these murders. I don't think I slept much, if any, and then got back to the police station at 9 o'clock, thought, well, the best thing for me to do now, before we have any further interviews, is to sit him down again so we can get a clear picture of, the detail that he was going to be able to provide now in relation to all these murders, because that's something that the police would have required. And he told me, oh, do you know what I told you last night? Yes. That wasn't true. That was a lie.
Oh my
I've
gosh.
been covering for my friend. It's my friend who murdered these people, not me, but I was covering for my friend. And his friend's name was Jason. And we couldn't get a surname from him. The only name we could get is his first name, Jason. And of course, that's totally unexpected. So I've gone from representing somebody who was being suspected of one murder to somebody who was admitting to 4 murders and between 20 and 30 assaults. And then about 5 hours later, somebody was telling me that all that was a lie and that he's just covering his friend that he had some relationship with, and that everything he told us in the middle of the night was untrue. It's quite a mind-boggling, confusing experience.
And bearing in mind, this all happened in a very short space of time. Yeah. We're talking, what, couple of days?
We're on day 3 after his arrest. By the time I'd been told this. So yes, it's a short period of time.
Working or having worked in criminal defence, I get this question a lot. And I think it's a question that unless you work in this area, people struggle to wrap their heads around. How can you defend someone who, in this case, for example, had allegedly murdered 4 men and who had at one point admitted to those crimes?
Yeah. Well, there's lots of things. First of all, my starting point with representing any client is that I'm there as a person to ensure that that individual's rights are protected. He or she who's arrested, they haven't actually been convicted of anything. They haven't been found guilty of anything. And they are therefore entitled to the same rights and protections as every other individual in England and Wales are entitled under our law. So that is my starting point. And that was always something that I felt very strongly about, is that I was there to protect those rights. I mentioned in my book that the criminal law tutor, and there's not many sort of university tutors that stick in my mind when I was in uni, but this guy does, because he was a bit of a hippie and I really liked him. We got on well and he was a real character. And he told us in one seminar or lecture on one occasion, remember that what you are, if you're going to be a criminal lawyer, you're not going to make much money, but you're the gatekeeper of rights, not only for individuals, but you're the gatekeeper of rights for everybody in the country. If what you're protecting falls down, then our whole system starts to fall down. And therefore, that stuck in my mind, that I've always felt that that is one of the most important things as far as my job as a criminal defence lawyer was concerned. And of course, the second thing is that bearing in mind that everybody has those rights, they have the right to a defence and to have that defence articulated to a court in the best way it can be. Now, they can, of course, represent themselves and do that, but nowadays it's felt that having somebody who's got a little bit more knowledge and experience of standing up in court may be preferable. And therefore, that's what I'm then doing, is articulating his or her defence to the court as well as it possibly can be. And that was the second thing that I felt very strongly about. And the third thing is that I was not there to lie for my client. My job is not to lie for anybody. My job is to put forward the best possible defence on the basis of what I've been told, but it's not to stand up and lie for anybody. And if I felt that my position was at any time being compromised because of that, I would tell my clients. And there are clients that I've lost because I think they're pulling a fast one and they are wanting me to lie on their behalf. And I'm not prepared to do that. And no lawyer worth their salt would do that. So as far as I'm concerned, those are the sort of three pillars, important pillars, that I would always rely on as a reason for my job as a defence lawyer. And I think that's the reasoning helps me every day when I used to go to court.
I think you are so right. When I blame television for this, which is that they present defence solicitors or defence lawyers as being a bit dodgy, who they're sort of willing to do anything to keep their clients out of prison.
Yeah.
And that even if that means lying or bribing or whatever the case may be. And it's simply not like that. You know, according to our rules and regulations that we work by, we owe a duty to the court above and beyond our clients.
Of course we do.
So we cannot mislead the court. And as you say, if a situation arises, then you have to sit your client down and say, right, this is the problem, or withdraw. One of the
interesting things that I had after my book came out, somebody contacted me, and he's a screenwriter of a few quite well-known, popular sort of different sort of shows on TV now. And he said, do you know what? I've been guilty of something, and I've realised once I've read your book what I've been guilty of. I've never given any proper lines to that lawyer sitting in the police interview.
Yes.
That lawyer is always the quiet one who doesn't say anything, makes a few notes in a book, and nothing is then said, and that's it. And he was saying, and I've been so guilty of that, and I'm going to change it. I'm not, that is going to change from now on. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. But it is true that that lawyer, that person who's there advice, they hardly ever say anything. You know, it's a man or woman who's sitting in the corner saying nothing usually.
Exactly. And the amount of times I've been sat with like my parents or my partner, and I've gone, it doesn't go like that. We're watching something, I'm going, why is the lawyer not saying anything?
Yeah, I agree
like
with you.
The police are berating the client, or misleading, or whatever the case may be, and I'm going, say something. They would say something.
Yes, exactly.
They don't just sit there and make notes. Like, we have to like sort of actively participate in some way.
But
That's
that
so
is
funny.
something that I think is interesting, and it is a misrepresentation we see on TV. It's not reality by any stretch. But we live with that and we accept it, even though it's very irritating for us lawyers to watch it.
It is. I just find myself chuckling. I just have to sort of laugh it off and say, well, if that's what they think that we do, then okay, whatever. Come to a real police station.
Yeah, exactly.
But moving away from the police station then, so you've now got a trial on your hands. And when preparing for this trial, what was going through your mind? Where do you start?
Well, I knew I had my work cut out preparing for it. Obviously, we were now running a defence, which was a bit weird, a bit strange, insofar as what had happened was that we'd had a client who'd admitted everything, and by this time now, evidentially, the police had a very strong case because they'd followed up all the admissions that he'd made. They'd traced bodies which he had said would be at a certain spot in the middle of a forest somewhere, and that there they were. So it was very, very difficult to prepare a defence on that basis. But that's what we had to do. Our defence was, okay, Peter Moore knows about this. He was told about in detail about all these murders, but he wasn't the murderer. He wasn't the person who wielded the knife. So initially, I thought, having not had experience of a case of this magnitude before, that what I would do would contact somebody who had, and I knew a barrister by the name of Dewi Williams. He was a Liverpool barrister, but he had only a few years before been involved as one of the junior counsel in the Jamie Bulger case, representing one of the defendants in that case. And I thought that as a result of that, Dewi would be one who has recent experience of dealing with a big case, experience of dealing with a case which was likely to be of a high profile, maybe not as much as Jamie Bulger, but certainly with a profile in the press and the media and so on, and also one where there was a considerable, a voluminous amount of stuff that we needed to get through before trial. So he was very keen when I spoke to him to get involved. And it was really from there that we started to prepare our defence, going to see our client on a regular basis. He was initially in Walton Prison in Liverpool, but then he was moved on to Wakefield Prison. I was called by the main lawyer for the Crown Prosecution Service in North Wales. And she was somebody that I knew anyway because of my work. And she said, Dylan, what's the size of your car? Because I wanted to collect all the statements, all the unused material. And I said, well, I've got an estate, So she said, oh, yeah, well, you may get away with it. So let's see, bring your car. We'll see if we can get everything in. And I I filled the boot, I filled the back seat, and I had 2 boxes on the passenger seat as well. And that's the amount of material I had to go through prior to trial. So you can imagine the size of the
Yeah, I
case.
can. How long did that take? Because obviously, when you've got to prepare for trial, you have to have private consultations with your client to take instructions, and that
Mhm.
includes getting their instructions on every piece of evidence
Yes,
that stands against them or
yes,
might even be in favor of them. But you have to get their comments.
yeah.
So, how many meetings did you end up having?
Countless meetings. I travelled to Liverpool. This was a year. It took a year out of my life to prepare for this case. By the time, because we had some hearings when we had to go down, pre-trial hearing, for instance, was down in London because the High Court judge, Maurice Kay, decided he was the High Court judge for our circuit of Chester and North Wales. And because of the nature of the case, he decided that he was going to be the trial judge.
Mhm.
And he spent most of his time down in London. So any matters that have to be dealt with him, for instance, the pre-trial hearing and so on, was all down in London in the Royal Courts of Justice because so we all had to travel down there en masse,
Oh my
which
goodness.
maybe may not be the way things would work nowadays. I'm not too sure, but it was not that well, it wasn't convenient at the time. Um, so it took a year of going to see the client on the regular basis, taking statements from him, going through everything, and then choosing a QC that we felt was suitable for Peter Moore. That was something that we had to do, and we chose a guy called Eric Somerset Jones, no longer with us. But Eric was the closest to the Rumpole of the Bailey character that I've ever met. Absolutely no messing. He just gave it as it was. And you needed that with somebody like Peter Moore because Peter Moore is such a manipulative individual. Um, he would twist your words and turn your words, and he would try and take advantage of all opportunities. And as a result of that, you needed somebody who was just straight as a die with him, and certainly you got that with Eric Somerset Jones. And then after that, we had to visit all the crime scenes. Um, some of those were remained thoroughly unpleasant. The first man who was murdered in a place called Caer Geiliog, which is on Anglesey near Holyhead, about 3 or 4 miles away from Holyhead, and his house was just like a hovel. It was just the most awful place. I describe it in the book, and it was just shocking. And both Dewi Williams and myself were sort of retching as we left the house because it was so horrible. And we went to Clocaenog Forest, where the man from Liverpool had been abducted and killed in the forest, and his body was dumped in the forest. And his body had lain in the forest under the trees for a good 3 or 4 months. And what I was shocked when I went there were two things. The photographs of the scene when the body was found was very disturbing because animals had got to the body and torn the body apart, and it was horrible. But the other thing about it was that as we got under the trees, the silhouette on the ground of a dead body was still there.
Oh,
And
how creepy.
that was just Dewi and myself sort of just stood there staring at this shape of a body on the sort of dry tree material which was on the ground, and it had obviously imprinted itself somehow on the ground because it was so dry there under the trees, and that was quite a disturbing moment. It's one of those of many moments that sort of stuck in my mind during those preparation days. So we went through a lot in 12 months.
I was going to say, it sounds like you did. And as you've reviewed all of this evidence, I mean, the however many boxes that you had to go through, what did you think of the strength of the prosecution's case? Did your opinion change, or?
Well, no, it didn't. The obviously the prosecution had lots of things in their favour. The admission clearly in the middle of the night was one thing, and they could have hung their hat on that, I think, and more or less gone with that. But clearly there were other elements of evidence, sightings, not of Peter Moore, but of his vehicle, a trace of blood on the beach murder. It appears that Peter Moore cut his hand, and that a little bit away from the dead body, the guy who was murdered, there was a little blotch of blood which didn't belong to the man who'd been murdered, but it was linked then to Peter Moore. So that was a difficult one to come across, is how, building a defence, are you going to explain that one? There were other things as well, which I suppose on reflection you would say are pretty sort of classic serial killer type behaviour. It was clear that Peter Moore had a pattern, and he would like to follow that pattern. It's a pattern which made him secure. The way he dressed, he would dress always in dark. He may wear a police hat or a sort of Nazi style cap. He dispatched his victims with a knife. He would stab them more than once. Certainly, the victims would be stabbed 6 or 7 times. On one occasion, the victim was then stabbed in the backside and sort of in the anus area, which is an indication of piquerism, which is sort of something that some serial killers enjoy, which is sort of, because there's a sexual element to the attack, they then stab certain areas within the body, and that was something that Peter Moore was demonstrating as part of the way that he would kill his victims. He would also, as a number of serial killers do, take a trophy from the body itself, so that he could relive the experience of killing his victim, knowing that maybe a wallet or a watch or something like that was in the possession of the victim at the time that he was being assaulted and killed by him, and that would help him relive the experience of the killing itself. So he had those in his house. He had trophies belonging to all his victims in the house. And also in his house, he had cuttings of every murder. So every newspaper cutting from everything that was reported about the 3 murders at the time, because the 4th murder was unknown. But the 3 murders, there was newspaper cuttings about everything. Every day he'd cut something out of the local paper or the national paper, and there was a huge pile in his house of all these cuttings. Now put all those together, and we're on a hiding to nothing, really. But our instructions were that it was Jason. Those were our instructions. It wasn't him. Now, clearly, then I've subsequently been told, because I wasn't going to make any efforts to try and find Jason, but I've been subsequently told by the prosecution QC that Alex Carlisle, that they made efforts. He'd actually requested that the police make an effort to try and trace Jason, to no avail. So he wasn't to be found. Make that of what you will.
Yeah, absolutely. See, I mean, you could, his instructions, obviously you have to just work with whatever instructions you are given. That's all you can do.
Yes.
Now, him saying that he's got, you've got the trophies in the house and you've got, the newspaper cuttings. It's all, that's fairly significant, but the blood at the scene is a bit of a clincher.
It's a bit of a clincher, and it's very difficult. How do we explain that?
Exactly.
We can't. And Peter Moore was a person who frequented that beach. It was a well-known spot for sort of gay community in particular to go and find sort of sex, and he would do that. And we could say at trial that he had done that recently. So that throws some doubt into the jury's mind, of course. But whether we can say on every occasion that there is a chance that he will have spilt some blood is a different thing. But maybe we didn't have to go that far. What we were attempting to do is sow the seeds of doubt in the jury's minds. That's what our job is, and place a little bit more of the initiative with the prosecution, so that they have to work a little bit harder in order to prove their case. That's what we would. That's really the best that we could expect. And we've been honest with Peter Moore as well. He knew that he had an extremely difficult defence for us to run, and he knew that as a result of that, he had problems. So it wasn't the case of us hiding anything from him. We were honest with him and saying, if this is the best we've got, we work with this, and this is the best we've got. But we're not making any promises.
With the victims, the 4 men that he did murder, because obviously we've got these other assaults as well.
Yes.
Do you know why he killed those 4 men and not the others, if I can word it like that? What was it about these 4 men? Was it just I don't know, an opportunity, or was there anything distinct?
Well, I'm now theorizing, but and to some extent, some of this is substantiated by what Peter Moore has told me, and other parts of it are just me sort of putting things together and coming to a conclusion. Peter Moore was homosexual. He behaved in a deviant way as far as that homosexuality was concerned. I don't think he had any sort of regular partners, or he didn't live with anybody or anything of that nature. His sexuality focused on sort of deviance, and he was within a group of people whose behaviour we subsequently found out was quite sort of deviant and unusual. That deviancy led to him behaving in a way which meant that he thought that he could have sexual pleasure by stopping somebody at the middle of the night, half killing them, masturbating over them, which he would usually say he would do, and then leaving them. That was his sexual There was a kind of living out some sexual fantasy that he had, and he would do that. And his behaviour would become more and more and more deviant all the time, to the extent that in the end, I think it became a perfect storm. His mother died. Maybe he thought that, his life as he knew it was coming to an end or changing, or, all the people that he loved and relied on had now disappeared, and that it didn't matter how he behaved. And as a consequence of that, it went from half killing somebody to actually killing somebody. And I asked during the interview, I think one of the interviewers asked first of all, and then I sort of asked afterwards, well, why did you do that? Why did you feel that you wanted to do that? And his answer to that was for fun.
Wow.
And that was his answer. It was for fun. And then I asked him, well, how did it feel to kill somebody? How did it feel to stab somebody until they're dead? And he answered, well, it was just like putting a knife through butter.
Wow.
So for him, there was no emotion linked to that.
I was going to say, there's just nothing.
No. It was just like putting a knife through butter. It was easy. And he enjoyed it. And
wow.
He thought that he'd done a good job. One of the things that he said was, well, after I killed the second man in Anglesey, I thought it was a job well done. He'd actually gone there with the intention of killing somebody, and, he'd done a good job of it. And that's how he looked at things. He also told us that on one occasion, he was driving back from his cinema in Holyhead across the Isle of Anglesey. And he got to about halfway, and there's a town right in the middle of Anglesey called Llangefni. And he decided, it was about midnight, and he decided he'd drive into Llangefni. So he drove into Llangefni, and as he was driving into the town, he noticed a man walking maybe home, and it was dark, and he had decided, right, I'm going to kill him. And fair play to him, he then followed the one-way system through Llangefni. So, didn't break the law.
At least he obeyed the rules of the road, I suppose.
Yes,
Oh,
followed the one-way system. And by the time he got back, this man had disappeared. And
wow, that is a close call.
I've always said, well, he would have killed him. He would have killed him. And I've always said to myself, now that man may be walking around today, around Llangefni maybe,
Yeah.
not realising how close he was that day to being killed. Because if he was still on that road, he would have been killed.
That's terrifying.
It is, isn't it?
That's, as you say, he could be going about his business now.
Yeah.
Not knowing how close
he was. And maybe it's a good thing he doesn't know. But he was very, very close. And then the other story I've got with that is that he told me also that when he felt that he was going to be caught, if he felt, because he was caught really before the end of this, he would have carried on killing, there's no doubt about that. But he said to me, if he felt that he was close to being caught, because he'd had some debt problems with the HSBC bank, he was going to make an appointment with the bank manager here in Abergele with HSBC, and he was going to kill him in the consulting room and then wait for the police to arrive.
Yeah, I don't quite know what to say to that.
And the strange thing about that is that I knew the bank manager.
Oh my goodness!
And I thought it was a bit of one of these things that I'd been worrying about, is that, well, when the trial comes out, my friend, the bank manager, is going to know that
Yeah,
he was
that
on
was the
Peter
plan.
Moore's plan. And so I did decide to take him for a drink one night and break the news to him before the trial that
Yeah.
he was on the list. He turned white.
I mean, you would, wouldn't you? You,
Yeah,
how do you process that? And this is just because Peter Moore had issues, financial issues, and
yeah, he'd
so
had
was
a
going
few
to take it
debts.
out on the bank manager at
So that was his
HSBC.
last hurrah sort of thing. When he felt that he was close to being caught, he would make an appointment and then kill the bank manager in the consulting room of the bank.
There is absolutely no, there's no respect for, or he doesn't see the value in human life.
No, no, not at all.
Everyone's just sort of dispensable. Um,
Yes,
uh,
yes.
I've got an issue with you, so that's how I'm going to choose. And it seems to be that it's partly opportunistic as well. The man who almost became a victim was just walking down a
Yeah,
street.
exactly.
It's and the bank manager thing is absolutely chilling
Yeah, it
because
is. Yeah.
he personally might not have had any dealings with Peter at
Nope.
all, but because
But
he's the bank manager.
yep, that's it's quite frightening. But the
mm,
the selection of victims was totally at random to a great
yeah,
extent. It was a random choice. It was something that his decision was made on a whim, really, more than anything else. And he was, as the judge said during his trial, the most dangerous of men that the judge had ever come across, who had ever been in Wales or maybe in the UK, as dangerous as others, because he would have carried on. He was just, as it happened, he'd been caught after killing 4 people. He would have killed others as well.
well, let's talk about the trial itself. How was that experience for you?
Well, it was the culmination of 12 months of hard work to start off with. And going back to my sort of acting comments at the beginning of this interview, I suppose it's the grand show, it's the grand performance after all that preparation, and it did to some extent feel a bit like that. And as you know, the court does feel like that. Um, there was a lot of preparation involved, and we knew what was going to be the approach that the prosecution were going to take. Alex Carlile, the QC, we knew how he would approach the case. He would approach the case with meticulously, putting down, giving the jury all the details that they needed. Um, it really was a good presented prosecution, and clearly our efforts to defend that and to cross-examine witnesses to some extent was difficult because we knew the nature of the case, we knew the extent of the evidence against Peter Moore, and we knew the weaknesses as far as his defence was concerned as well. So that presented us with difficulties, but clearly we've got to go through the process. And Peter Moore, as well as everybody else, could see what was happening during the course of the trial, and there was a lot of evidence. There was a lot of police officer evidence. Statements were read out. The interviews were read out clearly. That 2 o'clock in the morning interview was read out, and clearly Alex Carlile made as much as he could of that, as you would expect him to do. The interesting thing, of course, was when we got Peter Moore into the witness box, and our defence relied on him giving evidence, was that he gave his evidence in a clear, measured, very matter-of-fact way. He didn't deviate from what he had said, that it was all Jason and so on. He stuck to that. He was clear about that. And even in the cross-examination by Alex Carlile, that remained the same. And, the question was, in my mind, was Alex Carlile, who was a very experienced and capable prosecutor, was he going to tear him to shreds in the witness box, or was he just going to leave it there? And I think he did the right thing. He didn't need to tear him to shreds. The evidence was clear. The story as it was by Peter Moore was questionable. And as a result of that, he didn't have to go for him hammer and tongs. He could just leave the story there and allow the jury to make their own decisions.
Can I quickly ask, did they manage to track down the victims of any of the victims of the assaults?
Now, what's interesting about that is that they did track down some, but they were unwilling to get involved.
Oh, okay.
And I think a lot of that, well, the hints I got from police officers who were involved in that was that in some assaults, maybe it wasn't just a case of somebody walking down the street and being clobbered and then assaulted in a sexual way. Maybe there was some reciprocation there from the person, and that as maybe it started as some kind of consensual sexual thing, but then Peter Moore then lost it and attacked this guy. So there was an element of embarrassment and not wanting to get involved, and not wanting the story to come out, because maybe they were homosexual, or maybe they were sort of leading a double life or something, and that they didn't want other people to know about it.
Okay.
So there was, even though they tracked a few of the victims down, there was a lot of reticence in getting involved in the case or not. And of course, at that stage, when the police are asking the question, the police are then thinking, well, do we need to get this information anyway? The man's been charged with 4 murders. Is he going to be out soon? Chances are no. Is there a point then of dragging all this up and maybe making other people's lives a misery as well? So I think that was the reasoning behind it and the decisions that they made.
Well, that makes sense. Were there other witnesses who gave evidence during the trial?
Yes, there were witnesses who knew Peter Moore and knew of his deviant behaviour. Not sort of, they were sort of people who knew of the way that he had behaved in the past. They were witnesses of witnesses who had seen his van at Pensarn Beach, the last murder that happened on the beach. There were more than one witness who'd come forward because a confidential line had initially been opened. Phone line had been opened for people to contact the police if they suspected somebody. And yes, people had responded to that. And a number of those people have then come to court and given evidence as well. A lot of the evidence, of course, was then police evidence. You had a lot of evidence from the scenes of crimes and so on, because you had 4 scenes of crimes and all the evidence in relation to that. So there was pathology evidence as well. So there there was 4 murders. 1 murder is a lot.
Yeah.
4 murders is enormous as far as the volume of a case is concerned.
And as the trial went on, did the strengths and weaknesses in the prosecution's case change at all?
I would say there weren't many days during that trial that I thought the prosecution didn't have the upper hand. There were some days where, because of the nature of our Queen's Counsel, Eric Somerset Jones, he's a clever man. He could twist things around all over the place, and he certainly did that on occasions, but not sufficiently in the end to sow any seeds of doubt in the mind of the jury. And I think there weren't many days during that trial that I sort of returned home thinking, oh, well, that was a pretty good day. I think all of the days went as we anticipated, but there weren't any sort of glimmers of hope. Not many, anyway. So, no.
Did any parts of the trial, are there any parts that really stick in your mind, or that you think,
Yeah.
oh, I'll never forget that?
It's the day that he gave evidence. I was a little bit unsure, even though I think I knew how Peter Moore would respond when he was put in the witness box. And I knew the way that our barristers would lead him through or not lead him, but help him with the evidence or question him about the evidence. So I was sort of confident that he would be able to manage that. What I wasn't sure of was how he was going to cope with being cross-examined. And I think that was, for me, quite an unforgettable day, was when he got into the witness box, started his evidence, and there was this sort of question in my mind, right, is he going to hack this? Is he going to be able to take this? And the surprising thing is he did. He didn't sort of collapse into a massive heap. He stuck to his story, as unbelievable as that may have been. And he didn't waver from that at all. And then the second part, which I remember clearly, is on the final day when he was convicted. He was found guilty. The jury came back, found him guilty, and he was then sentenced. And afterwards, I got out of court, and the usher in the court said, "You're not going to believe this. There's just a load of cameras and reporters and everything outside there, and they've asked whether you could go down and say something." And really, you do in those, we do see lawyers obviously at the steps of courtrooms making sort of statements and so on. And you're asking yourself, well, what am I going to be able to add to this by going out there and saying something? And I remember going back into the robing room where Dewi and Eric were, and Alex Carlisle actually. And I said, what am I going to say? What can I say? So between the three of us, we sat down and we drafted a little statement, which was sort of very non-committal. Peter Moore had said to me, that he wanted to appeal. There were lots of questions that I'd be asking at that stage, but it was this sort of feeling that I had to go out there and say something which made sense and which I knew would be on all the news programs that evening, and that I didn't look a complete idiot standing there trying to excuse the behaviour of somebody like Peter Moore, which I wouldn't have wanted to do.
Did you at any point want to withdraw from this case?
No, I didn't want to withdraw from the case. It was an extremely difficult case.
I can imagine. I can only imagine.
It was a case, and I do talk about this in my book, which took its toll on me, and had an effect on me for years and years later. But as a lawyer, your training as a lawyer, as with any other profession, to get these opportunities.
Mm.
And as a criminal lawyer, we're all in the back of our mind thinking, ooh, I wonder what would happen if I got into that police station and, there was somebody there arrested for murder or some big case, and, you're there advising them and so on. And that's certainly something that I'd always done as a young, ambitious lawyer, is to think, oh, it would be great if I had a big case, a nice juicy case I could get my teeth into. And this certainly came at the right time for me. It was a case that I wouldn't have given to somebody else or passed on to somebody else. It was a massive challenge. And the only thing I think on reflection is that maybe it was unfortunate is that, I was working in a firm of solicitors, and maybe people didn't realize, my colleagues didn't realize, and I didn't vocalize either, how massive the case was, how difficult and challenging it was, and how much of my time it took. I sort of did it without whinging or complaining. I just put my head down and did it. And maybe as a result of that, I didn't get all the support I should have had from my colleagues at that time. And maybe it was my fault for not, voicing that. And maybe I should have done that. But also maybe more experienced lawyers in the firm should have said, hey, let's take a bit of your casework away from you and let you concentrate on this. Because I was working, usually getting into the office about 6-7 o'clock, working on the murder case, doing all my other cases during the day, and then working the murder case in the evening again, and going home about 8-9 o'clock. For 12 months, that does take its toll physically and mentally on somebody, even though, at the time you feel, this is brilliant, I've got to do it. But on reflection, it certainly took its toll on me.
That's the other thing that TV, it's another way TV is quite misleading, is that it portrays solicitors as only having like one case at a time. Yes. And they can dedicate all their time to that one case, and you go, no, that's not the way that life goes, unfortunately. It'd be great.
All your other clients going to magistrates court and crown court and all the other things that they've... So all that life goes on, and you...
Absolutely.
And, your colleagues are also saying, oh, make sure you get your costs in. All this stuff. And, it's a very, very difficult thing it's a balance that is extremely difficult to strike when you do get this type of case, because time-wise, it's so demanding, and emotionally, it's so demanding as well.
So because as you said, it's 12 months that leads up to a trial that you put all your time, all your energy, all your emotion into. So when you heard that the verdict was guilty on all counts, what was your first thought or thoughts?
Well, I think the first thought, or my first hope, was that we as a defence team had done as much as we can for the defendant. Going back to what we were talking about, these principles of giving them all make showing that their rights are defended and so on, that we'd done that. And I was very happy. I mentioned this in the book, is that Alex Carlyle came up to me at the end and said, "You dealt with that in an exemplary way. I wanted to tell you." And that, coming from a prosecution lawyer and QC, I thought, right, yeah, okay, I have done what I needed to do for this client. And I think even though we heard the 4 life sentences and the judge's direction that this man was to stay in prison for the rest of his life, and that was the recommendation that he was making, at least I was satisfied that I'd done as much as I could in that case with the tools I'd been given. And I think that's very important for any lawyer, that you come from a case knowing that you have done your best and that there isn't anything else that you couldn't have done. Because, it's horrible. And we've all had cases where we think, "Oh, I wonder, if we'd done this or done that." We've all had cases like that. But this was certainly a case, because of the effort I'd put into it, that I was very satisfied that, I'd left no stone unturned at the end of it. And then, of course, the reality is, when you speak with your client, then, well, he's thinking about, he wants to appeal, and so, we've got to go back to sort of the real world, and we've got to think about, well, is there a merit for an appeal against conviction? I had to speak with the QC about that. My feeling was that there wasn't, and certainly the guidance I had from Queen's Counsel at the time was the same, that there wasn't. But the main thing that I wanted to be satisfied with, that we had done everything that we could for our clients. That's our job. And if we'd done that and discharged those responsibilities as best we could, then we could walk out down those steps of the court that afternoon satisfied in the knowledge that we'd done the best job.
So you weren't involved in Peter's appeal, is that right?
Well, no. I saw him a couple of times after the trial. He'd actually gone initially to the prison up in Durham. I can't remember the name of the prison now. So he'd been there for a while before then being transferred to Wakefield prison. So I saw him twice up in Durham, and then I saw him once in Wakefield, and we were sort of discussing, what were the merits of an appeal and so on. And my view was that, we were on hiding to nothing. Now, my understanding is that Peter Moore has exercised a lot of energy over a number of years, considering and seeking the advice for an appeal. His appeal to the European Court of Human Rights, which may know about, was an appeal that was made with others about the merits of a life sentence with no determinable end to it. And from a criminal law point of view, that was quite an interesting appeal, whether under the terms of the Human Rights Act, he and others should be basically told that they were never going to be released, and there was no prospect of them being released from prison. Now, my understanding is that following that appeal, the law hasn't changed. Things have remained the same, and people can still be sent to prison with a recommendation that they spend their whole lives in prison. And I think there are about 70, 80 full life sentence prisoners in the UK or in England and Wales at the moment. But I wasn't involved in anything further with regard to that. And I didn't hear from him until I decided finally to write my book, and I'd got a commission to write the book from the Welsh Book Council. And I started to think about, well, how am I going to actually go about doing this? And my thoughts were that it would have been very interesting, as we were coming up to the 25 years since his arrest, to meet up again in Wakefield Prison and have the opportunity of discussing the case. And I wrote to that effect to Peter Moore in prison, not really sure, and this was in about August 2019, and I wasn't too sure whether I'd receive a response or, whatever, but I knew he was in Wakefield Prison, so I gave it a shot. I wrote a letter, and about 4 weeks later, I received a response, and his response was that he was be willing to see me, and that he would be willing to cooperate with me in writing a book, and that he was happy to hear that I was writing the book, and so on and so forth. Very sort of positive. And that remained the same for about 6 months. And I received a lot of correspondence from him during that 6 months, until such time as I then got a letter from him a week before I was due to go and see him, telling me that he changed his mind and that he didn't want to see me anymore. I wasn't completely surprised.
I'm not completely surprised, because from what you said, he's a bit of a manipulative character.
Oh yeah, certainly.
So to I don't quite know the right way to word it, but to kind of say, yeah, I'm completely up for it, and you almost not get your hopes up, that's not the right word, but here's the carrot, and then I'm going to take that away. I don't know. I don't know if it's kind of exercising control or I don't know.
That's what he likes doing. His behaviour and his crimes demonstrated his like for controlling a situation and so on.
Yeah.
So that isn't a particular surprise. And he is a very manipulative individual. He's a very devious individual. And he will play a game as he likes playing. And he played a game, maybe he thought he was playing a game in the police station.
Maybe.
With all this Jason stuff, and that this was his opportunity to exert whatever power he still had, of messing around my arrangements and so on. And I think maybe that's what he was doing. And again, in the middle of September, after not hearing anything from him since February of this year, and the publication date for my book was the 25th of September. A week before that publication date, I received a letter, and my publisher received a letter from him threatening legal action if we were to publish. Which, of course, as you would expect, neither myself nor my publisher took any notice of at all. And in fact, the press we got out of that threat was very useful to publicise the book.
Excellent. It's funny how these things work out, isn't it?
It is, isn't it?
So we kind of touched upon this, but how has this case affected you? Because I, when researching for this interview, read that apparently you received a Christmas card from Peter Moore to your home address,
yes,
which I would think would be absolutely terrifying.
Yes. Now this was during the time that I was preparing for the book, and that we're having some exchange of correspondence. On the other hand, it's the last thing that you would expect a few days before Christmas is to open a red envelope addressed to myself and my family, wishing us best regards for Christmas, from Peter Moore, from Peter, actually, not Peter Moore, from Peter, as he put it in the card, and wishing us, all the best. and my wife was a bit unnerved, to say the least,
Yeah, I
and
can imagine.
horrified. And as you've sort of alluded to there, what I hadn't realised at the time that I was involved in the case was that it was having an effect on me mentally. It's something that only in retrospect have I been able to come to terms with that, and even realise that being involved in such a case can be detrimental to somebody's mental health, to their the way their outlook, the way they look at things. I suffered a breakdown in 2009. Now, this is years after the case, but when you start delving into with your counsellors and so on, the reasons why things have happened, you then begin to realise that one of the elements of the breakdown was that I was suffering from some kind of PTSD and so on, and I was having recurrent dreams and thoughts involved with the case, and I was even sort of imagining somebody running up behind me and stabbing me in the back if I was alone walking up a street when it was a dark night. Quite suddenly, this would come over me, and those kinds of things are things which you dismiss at the time because you think you're a tough guy, and you're trying to be professional, and these are the things that they're never going to affect me because I'm above all this, and I can handle situations like this. And it's only years afterwards that you realise that maybe you're not as tough as you thought you were, and that these things do have an effect, and that these things do stay with you. And that maybe you should have sought help sooner and recognised the problems that you're suffering. And that certainly is something that happened to me. At the time, I wouldn't have accepted or recognised it. On reflection, I only know too well what the effects are.
Before we sort of end this interview, we cannot end it without talking about your book, The Man in Black, which is named, obviously it's about Peter Moore, but it's because of the clothing that he would wear. What would you like to tell people about your book?
Well, I decided to write the book. I didn't want the book to be some kind of gory, bloodthirsty thing, with full of blood and gore, and that's not what it's turned out to be. I was focusing on this being the story of a journey, my journey involved with the case, involved with this man, and what happened to me afterwards. And maybe you realize as I'm speaking to you now and talking about the effect of the case on me, that's been a long journey, not only dealing with the case itself, but everything that happened afterwards. And I think that is a very important element of my story, is to be able to recite all that journey and the relevance of the Peter Moore case in that journey to me. So that's what the book is about. And I hope it's a clear description of how difficult, challenging, exhilarating, and unbelievably exciting being involved in such a case is, and how difficult and sometimes how painful the reflecting on those experiences can be. I finished my book down on the beach in Pensarn where the last murder happened, and it was in April of this year, and I'm standing there reflecting on that last murder and everything that was happening in the world at that time and still is with this COVID and everything that's going on, and maybe thinking that turning my back on those events now is best for me, and leaving the tide to wash in and clear the beach of all that was there before. And maybe that's how I end my book, and that's how I feel about the story.
I think that's a very good ending to a story.
Thank you.
Good ending. To conclude this interview then, is there anything that you would like to say to the people listening?
No, I hope if they have the opportunity to read the book that they enjoy it and that they take something out of it. And I'm happy to talk with people if they're interested in having a chat about the book. I've got no problems with that at all. I'm very open about my story and about what happened. But in the end, the most important thing is that you read it and you get something out of that story.
I'd like to say a huge thank you to you, Dylan, for joining me today and chatting to me about.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
About this case. If you listeners want to know more about the man in black, Peter Moore, I'll include a link to the book in the show notes. And Dylan, if you're happy, I'll also include maybe your Twitter as well. So if people want to contact you, you can.
Happy to do so.
Thank you so much for your time today, Dylan.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.
And that's the end of today's episode. A huge thank you to Dylan Rhys Jones for joining me, and a huge thank you to you for also joining us today. The Student's Verdict is a bi-weekly podcast, so follow us on social media to hear about our next episode. The Student's Verdict can be found anywhere you listen to podcasts, including Spreaker, YouTube, and iHeartRadio. See you on the next one, and remember to keep living the dream.